All right, and welcome to the Self-Made Math. It is Tuesday night, and so it is time for the Self-Made Math. Tonight, we are going to, big surprise, check in with the nickel market in London and talk a little bit about my college years and how I rode the curve through most of college until I didn't ride the curve anymore and wiped out. But we'll get to that in just a second. Before we do that, just a reminder that the Coalition Radio Network is viewer and fan funded. That means you can go out and grab a t-shirt. That means you can go out and make a donation on Patreon. You can also, if you own a business and you want to do some advertising for a nominal fee, that'll go a long way and do a lot of good. You can also reach out to us and we can get you set up with a package to help support the network, because we are in an election year for those of you who have been living in a cave or otherwise occupied. And there's going to be a lot of interesting stories coming out. Most of the local news outlets will cover them in a particular way, if they cover them at all. But Pat and his tripod are always out taking real-time coverage as it happens, so that you can see what has actually happened with all the context around it, and not necessarily what has been conveniently edited into a 60 or 90-second spot on local news or unreported altogether. It's always, every once in a while, I'll walk through the house and find that my wife is working, but also has a COVID briefing or some sort of a government press conference up that's of interest to her. And sometimes I'll know why she's watching it, because we'll have talked about some aspect of it that was important to her, and other times I'll have no idea why she's watching it. And one time I asked her, so is there a big announcement coming? I hadn't seen anything. You didn't say anything. And she will just look at me and go, "No, I'm just waiting for Pat Ford to ask a question." Because Pat will always ask a very good, very thoughtful question, and the fact that it's a very good and very thoughtful question means that it irritates our elected officials to no end to have to answer it on camera. So that puts a little sparkle in her day, and as a result, she's got herself a Coalition t-shirt. And I would encourage everyone to do whatever you can to support it, support the network. Buy a t-shirt. Like I said, there's merch. Share the links. Give us a thumbs up. And try and get other people involved in following some of these stories in a different format than what you typically see in corporate media, even at the local level. So with that, let's get to item number one, which is the London Metals Exchange nickel market. Now, for those who are new, I'll give a little bit of a background on this. When I started doing this live stream on Tuesday nights, I did a piece on, and you can go back and watch it, on nickels, and what was the value of the metal that actually makes up the nickels, and they're 75% copper and 25% actual nickel. And what's the meltdown value of that 5-cent coin versus what it spends for, which is of course 5 cents. And what we found in that episode was that as copper prices and nickel prices were rising, the melt value is actually worth 6.5 cents versus the 5 cents that you could spend it on at a penny candy counter. Easy for me to say. Of course, it's not legal to melt down coins, so don't. But it is an interesting relationship, and we'll see how long that goes. And really didn't think too much of it until the news cycle took over, and all of a sudden nickel was in the news all over the place. And what we saw was at first increasing nickel prices, which made the value of those 5-cent coins higher. And then we started to see sanctions come in as the war in Ukraine kicked off, and then some weird stuff started happening in the market. So let's take a look. I'm going to bring up a couple of slides and just kind of look at the last 30 days of price action and narrate through what's happened so far. There's a lot more to this story that's yet to be told. So, as that becomes public and in the news, I'll be watching it, and to the extent that there's a good episode with some great math, we'll do an episode on it. I suspect there's probably a really good story about financial risk management by big banks lurking in this thing somewhere, but we'll see. All the facts aren't out yet. So this is a price chart of nickel on the London Metals Exchange for the last 30 days. And if we look at this first yellow dot, that's the day that the Russians invaded Ukraine. So prices have been rising prior to that. You can't see January obviously on this chart, but they've been moving up steadily but slowly. And then, like I said, we've got the first event in our sequence, which is the invasion of Ukraine. And that was significant, obviously, because a war is kicked off, which can sometimes push commodity prices up, whether it's fuel, whether it's metals for weapons or other manufacturing, whatever the case may be. There's uncertainty, and so people tend to stockpile more of the resources that they're going to need. And so, we didn't really see much happen the first couple of days. It was fairly flat, but then within about 8 days or so, 6 days, we saw a fairly sizable increase, and that's the second dot. So from that first yellow dot to the second one, you're talking about 7 or 8 days. From 8 days into the invasion, we're suddenly up about 20% on the price of nickel. And the big driver there was sanctions. Sanctions started coming into the market, and people were looking around and trying to see, what came from Russia, and how much of that was going to be impacted, and how global supplies might be impacted by taking Russian supply off the market. And lo and behold, Russia is a significant producer of nickel. And so, that 20% has a lot to do with, fears that sanctions would hit Russian nickel, and that would take supply out of the market and push, less supply and equal demand. You're going to see prices go up. And then something else started to happen is people were assessing their nickel needs and their exposure to Russian nickel. They certainly didn't want to be caught holding Russian nickel that they wouldn't be able to sell on the market, to clear their trade. So there's some risk management going on. And lo and behold, somebody started to notice that there was an individual in the market who was going to have to buy a lot of nickel at some point in the very near future in order to satisfy their contractual obligations on the London Metals Exchange. And so they had obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, they had entered into a transaction where they sold the metal today, even though they didn't own it, because it was their belief that in the near future, the price would go down. They would be able to purchase that metal for cheaper than they sold it for, and they would keep the difference between the two as a profit. And so somebody figured out that there was an individual in that position, and they were in that position in a very big way. And so that is when you started to see this ridiculous, 2-day spike, or 1-day spike actually, from $13.70 up to almost $22 in a day. A huge move, record price, and that had everything to do with the fact that traders smelled blood in the water, and the feeding frenzy ensued. And so, round about that time when we hit the 2193 level, somebody at the London Metals Exchange said, there's something going on here. We should probably figure out what it is. And so we're going to close the market until we figure out what it is, what's going on, and how to rectify it. And that is reflected in these 6 dots. So 6 trading days where the market did not open. Nobody traded nickel, at least on the London Metals Exchange. And then after that 6 days, and they had kind of figured out who the culprit was that was in trouble, and who that individual owed money to in terms of big banks that they had sold to. They worked out a plan of some sort. Like I said, I haven't really seen the details yet, but some sort of plan to bail that speculator out in an orderly fashion, close out their positions, and make sure that the entire market didn't implode, and that they could safely reopen and go back to transacting business with that player, that injured player, out of the market. And so that's what you're seeing here. So very gradual market adjustments being made here as they kind of unwind everything. And they ended up canceling some people's trades. It was quite a mess from what I'm seeing so far. I haven't seen a comprehensive story yet, but I'm looking forward to it because I'm sure it's a good one. And then finally, once they felt like they had some semblance of order restored, now you're seeing prices kind of come back down to where they were before this whole thing kicked off, but still higher than they were when the Russians invaded Ukraine. So what you're seeing now is probably more reflective of the impact of a war and sanctions and removing Russian supply. And now we've hopefully pulled that troubled speculator out of the equation altogether. But like I said, somebody took those trades, and think about, use a sports betting analogy. Somebody's behind, they've lost a bunch of games, they've lost a bunch of money, and you continue to extend them credit so they can bet on more games and hopefully get even. And at some point you have to cut them off. And, if it's a mob movie, you go break their legs, but at some point you have to cut them off and collect. And that clearly wasn't happening here because somebody ran up, quite a debt. And then it got to the point where it couldn't be repaid, and it couldn't, control had been lost. And, so we closed the market for 6 days, and really looks more like 9 with the exception of that one little dip. So these things happen, but you're going to end up finding out that it's a big bank where you would expect far better risk management than was employed. And like I said, it should be a good story when it comes out. But these kinds of things, they happen every so often, and it's a big deal. And you're always shocked that the people in charge and the people throwing this kind of money around actually let it get that far out of hand, and let it get to where it got to. So with that financial risk management lecture, we will kick out of here and then talk a little bit about my college career. So I'm going to stop the share here and hopefully go back to the camera. Looks like I'm back on the camera in my Coalition t-shirt, and kind of pick up where last week's discussion ended, which was me sitting and playing a very, very simplistic video game in order to earn math credits in high school and graduate. That was the hot dog stand episode. I highly encourage you to watch the episode, and then there are actually people who have played this game and recorded it on YouTube. So to go take a walk down memory lane. So those are sort of worth a watch. And if you're a parent who maybe isn't fully concerned about math education for your young child, this is a reminder or an example of what can happen if if you don't get your hands around the problem early, or make sure that the problem never happens, preferably at all. But so that was hot dog stand last time. That was high school. Spoiler alert, I did actually graduate from high school, which was great. And I went on to Temple University in Philadelphia. Now, I grew up in southeastern PA, so Temple was a regional school, and large school, kind of catered to people like me who wanted a college education, weren't quite always the most diligent students, and they offered a lot of flexibility in terms of scheduling, so a lot of night classes for people who were working their way through, and turned out to be a good fit for me. It was a full, it wasn't a community college. It was a full 4-year university for those who aren't familiar with Temple, but it was a kind of provided the opportunity to slowly ramp into a full-time college schedule and take some flexibility if you're working to pay for it by yourself, which I was, and it was probably one of the best gifts my parents ever gave me, because they knew that I had underachieved in high school, and said, well, we're not going to put any real money into this. So you're going to go out, if you want a college education, you're going to, do it on, your own wallet, not ours, because you haven't really shown yourself to be the most applied, committed student in the past. And so, we've got concerns about putting money on this. And so, went out, I took out loans, I, worked a couple jobs and saved money, and went off to school the following September as a freshman and lived in the dorms. And really actually got serious about, making sure I attended class, did my homework, did the reading, all the things that I should have been doing in high school and all the things that I should have learned earlier. Suddenly, when it was my money, it all made sense, and things got done. So it was a good gift from the parents on that one, and really got me pointed in the right direction, with one notable exception, and that was math. And again, went in there with a very, very minimal math foundation. You're now in a 4-year university. I went into the business school, and I always remember going to, in those days, it was pre-internet, so everything was on paper and pencil, and forms were filled out by hand, and you stood in line to turn in those forms. And they did have a Scantron sheet to kind of read the little bubbles that you had put in, and manage the data entry. But I'll never forget the day that I drove down. I was about an hour away from my house in Philadelphia, and I went and I did some placement testing to see which classes I should start with in um, English or language arts and in math, and also get kind of an orientation about the basic core curriculum for the business school. So there's about a hour and a half orientation about all the classes, the different majors, and then the classes that would represent the business core that every business student took in order to get a business degree. And it's things like marketing 101 and finance 101 and accounting 1 and accounting 2, and all the things you would expect, business law, all the things you would expect from a business school. And then we got to the math requirement. And I'll never forget one of the associate deans saying, and of course there's math, because business is money and money is math. And this was one of the times in my life where I actually said something that I could not have been more wrong about. And I remember sitting there and hearing her say, business is money and money is math, and thinking to myself, well, you got part of it right, right? Because business is money, but how hard can the math be? Because you've got revenue coming in, you've got expenses going out, and you keep the difference, right? It's a little bit of subtraction, maybe some addition if you've got multiple expenses and multiple revenue streams. How hard could this be? Math. Um, Nonetheless, there was a math requirement, and the math requirements went, in my case, based on where I had tested in the placement testing process. I took, they didn't call it remedial math because they didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but I took something called Stat 11 and Stat 12, which was basically a 2-semester sequence of algebra functions, kind of the underpinnings of sophisticated algebra. Nowhere near pre-calc, wasn't that sophisticated. But I needed to take those 2 classes, and then sophomore year I would take what were known as Stat 21 and Stat 22, and that was business statistics, so means, medians, modes, standard deviations, the normal curve, all that great stuff. And like most people who don't like doing math, I, of course, rather than learn it, I'll just come up with a scheme or an approach for kind of getting through it, as I've done throughout high school. And the approach in college was known as riding the curve. And that meant you tried to find a section where that wasn't really popular, or you wouldn't necessarily have the best students. Night classes were generally thought to have lower standards. And, because people were working all day, they didn't always, put as much into, or have the time or the resources to put as much effort into their studies. So, a lot of times, a B- was, just fine for them. It got them reimbursed at work, and all was right with the world. So the standards tended to be a little bit lower in night class. So I took Stat 11 and Stat 12 at night, and we're all kind of looking at each other like, I don't understand, anything in this book, and I don't understand what the instructor is saying. And that was for a couple of reasons. Number one, the instructor was speaking in math, and number two, most of those intro level remedial type classes were taught by graduate students. And where did math graduate students come from even back then? Everywhere in the world except the United States and Canada. And so we had a lot of people for whom English was a second language, they had accents. And math majors aren't, and certainly, graduate math students aren't always known for their sparkling personality. So a lot of them would stand in front of the blackboard reading from the book. The students are behind them, they're talking to the blackboard throughout, and they would just, chalk their way through examples and kind of mutter into the book. So it was not a great educational experience. And then you were taking that not so great educational experience and combining it with a very low level of motivation. And so, what I was able to do in those classes is do just a little bit better than everybody else in the class, not everybody else, but most other people in the class, just enough to get that solid C, right? That pass that got you your credit, that got you the credential that you needed to get to the next level. So yeah, stat 11 and stat 12, both of those I was able to kind of not learn very much, if anything, and show enough work and kind of scratch out enough formulas that I'd sort of memorized and probably memorized incorrectly. But my results were better than other people's. And so I fell into the middle of the pack, and then I was therefore C. And this is one of those situations where, I talk about this all the time. A lot of times with math education is the benchmarking, right? So, you set your benchmark and say, oh, well, my kid is doing, about average in the state of Rhode Island. It's like, well, then they're not really doing as well as they should be, because they're in a pretty thin pool to begin with. And so even if you're at the top, or, top quartile, the top 25% of, the state of Rhode Island, it might not be good enough. And even, on a national level, might not be good enough. So you want to set a high benchmark so that you can really measure just how good you are and kind of put yourself up against the best. And I deliberately did not do that in order to get those C grades in stat 11 and stat 12. And so on we went to stat 21 and 22. Stat 21 did the same thing, took a night class, did marginally better than the next person, low benchmark. I was able to just kind of heave over it. And, stat 21 was in the books. I had one more required math class in my college career, stat 22, and did the same thing, took a night class. This instructor was a little bit different. She paid a little more attention to what was going on and was not as willing to, give generous credit to people who were trying to ride the curve. And so at the end of the semester, I got a D plus. I needed at least a C minus to get credit. I got a D plus. And so, I went in and talked to her about, the final, and, we went through my final exam in her class, and this was the same for all of them. I mean, the stress in trying to prepare for these things. You had no idea what you were doing. You're just looking for things in the textbook that you could memorize and write on the test sheet to try and get a couple of partial credit points. And, so we kind of go through the humiliating experience of, looking at my final exam for her class. And, there's a lot of blank pages, and a lot of stuff that was not, formulas or sequences or approaches that were written down that were not appropriate to the problem at all, not even close. And she said, yeah, I mean, we can take this in front of, the department chair if you want, but I'm not sure how, what you think is going to, in here is going to change, the result that I put on your grade sheet. So D plus it was. And she did me a huge favor by digging her heels in, right? Because I thought, well, I might be able to, she won't want to go through the hassle, and she won't, want to, ruffle feathers with, the department head. I mean, I don't know what kind of competition or, what she was trying to compete for in terms of scholarship money or whatever, but, she was not having my pushback, and she did me a huge favor, because I went back the following semester, registered for stat 22 during the day, because I realized that I had no idea what I was doing. And I showed up on time on the first day of classes for my, second sitting of stat 22. And I realized that they're opening up the new instructor is opening the class by reviewing stat 21. And I realized that I have no idea what she's talking about. So all of this stuff that's supposed to be just a quick refresh, 20-minute refresh of, the prior semester's work, I had no idea. And so I got up, walked out of the class. In those days, the first week of classes, you would carry around a catalog with all the courses, all the meeting times, all the rooms. And because things frequently changed, and you just kind of needed to know, oh, there's another, stat 22 class or stat 21 class that's being offered, on the other side of the building. So we'll just go in there. And I'd already figured out that, this instructor was actually pretty good. Daytime instructor, pretty good. And I didn't know what she was talking about. So I flipped a couple pages back in the catalog and I said, I got to go retake stat 21, and found a session that was meeting at that time, that same time slot, and went and sat down in the room in there. And I'll never forget it. The guy was he was he was an American, so English was his first language, which helped. But he was still speaking math. But he had this kind of bubbly personality, and he wasn't facing the blackboard when he spoke to the class. He was actually having a conversation and giving examples that made sense and that I could relate to. And a light clicked. And so I sat for the rest of the class, and then as soon as that was over, I ran to the registrar's office and dropped the stat 22 that I'd walked out of and added this guy in. But I took an entire semester stepward back, and that was a big thing. Like, I had to be honest with myself about the fact that I was never going to pass stat 22 based on what I knew about stat 21, which was nothing. The two were interrelated. It was a part one, part two situation. And if you didn't have that foundation in 21, you weren't going to get 22 ever. And so, there's that kind of moment of honesty, and it paid off because I ended up, getting in with this great instructor, and really I learned my 21, did well in class. I got an A- in a math class. Like, that had never happened before. And it's important to realize, or I should make the point, that it didn't just I suddenly learned all the other math I didn't learn at once. Business statistics was its own kind of separate discipline. And so the math, the functions, the linear algebra, all that stuff that I did not learn previously, didn't matter. It wasn't as big a liability that I didn't know those things, because business statistics was kind of like starting a new discipline from level one. And so, that helped obviously a lot. So good instructor, much better attitude, because I felt like, I was actually going to be able to pass this class, and I did well. And then when it came time to take stat 22, I made sure that I found a section that he was teaching, and I went and sat in that, and got an A-, B+ in there. And so that kind of moment of riding the curve will no longer suffice. You're at a wave there. You can't do it. You got close, but you didn't get there. And there's no way for you to get there doing what you've been doing. And in that split second going, I got to go take, just making the decision that, it's going to cost me some money, but I'm going to go take, stat 21 again. And, lucked into it didn't have names of the instructor. It just had rooms. So I happened to walk into the right room, and there was space in there. And that got me through business statistics in college. And I actually learned it. And it was that has never been a problem. There were plenty of other problems down the road, and we'll definitely talk about those. There were a lot of learning experiences to come, and just, getting my head around pre-calculus so that I could take calculus, so that I could take the probability exam for the Casualty Actuarial Society. That's a whole different episode for another time. But the moral of this story is, number one, always just, you're never going to be able to outrun the math. You're just not. If you're going to go into any kind of technical field, you will have to, get that skill. Not everybody has to be actuary level or PhD level, but ignoring a core component of your education for 11 years is just not the way to go. And at some point, you have to kind of have that moment where you really assess honestly where you are, the level of effort you've put in, what you've accomplished. And if it's not good enough, then you have to kind of swallow hard and just go back and redo it, and figure out where how far back you have to go, and what step, how big a step or two steps you have to take backwards in order to get your footing again. Now, the good news, if you're a parent, and your children don't love math, or they're struggling in math, or there's a particular concept, you've only got X number of years into the education process, right? So any problems that may have surfaced, or any concepts that may have, eluded the child, those can be made up fairly quickly. It's when you let it roll for an entire K through 12 career, and then as an adult take on the attitude that I don't need to know this, I'm not going to learn it. In fact, I dare you to try and teach me to learn it. That's when the real problems come in, and that's where the cleanup job is much bigger. So it's like anything else, nip it in the bud. Not such a big deal. And there's certainly, for anybody who's ever conquered something that was a problem or didn't come easily to them, but finally got through it and figured it out. There's a lot of satisfaction. So I think certainly any kid who's struggling with a math concept, their face is going to light up when they finally get it, and that is going to be an example that they can use in the future when they have challenges that they're just not sure how to get through. So that was the college years, undergraduate in a nutshell. Postscript: I really didn't take any more math classes in college, and I stayed away from quantitative finance, where you were going to be looking at curves and doing calculus to try and figure out the value of different financial instruments. I had to, it was an area that I was interested in, as you may have noticed by my, repeated and long discussions about nickel prices. But it wasn't something that I had the tool set for. So I never, wasn't able to dig into it until much, much, much later in life. But certainly not at the undergrad or even the graduate level when I was in business school out at Purdue. So that is tonight's kind of chapter in the self-made math story. So we've gone from hot dog stand to at least being able to pass and actually thrive in business statistics. We'll see where the world takes us next. But yeah, there's still graduate school. There's still actuarial exams to go, and how you actually figure that stuff out as a very, very old student is there's probably a couple of good nuggets in there as well. So we'll leave it here for now. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I implore you, it is election season, and we want to keep local independent media, make sure that they're viable and they're able to cover the stories the way that they should be covered, which is unvarnished, transparent, and long form. So go buy a t-shirt, go pass some links around, get other people involved, and put them onto this. And we will see you next time right here on the Self-Made Math. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye.